In this class, we're going to have a look at Paul's prison epistles. These are those letters that Paul wrote from prison, and we're talking about the letters of Ephesians, Philippians, Colossians, and also the letter to Philemon. We're going to dip into these letters, but before we get started, we need to say a few things by way of introduction. As you probably picked up by now, one of the things that biblical scholars, and in this case especially Pauline scholars, try to do is to recreate the biography of biblical characters. And in this case, we're talking about the biography of Paul. And they do that by putting together evidence from Acts and Paul's own letters and try to come up with a timeline and a chronology of events in Paul's life, and then try and locate where was he when he wrote each of his letters. So in this case, when we come to the prison epistles, the topic that's of primary interest in this regard is which prison imprisonment are we talking about? Now, on the face of it, I think our first impulse is to assume that the imprisonment that we're referring to here is the one that is at the end of Acts, where Paul is under house arrest in Rome. But unfortunately, the picture's not quite that straightforward. For example, in Acts itself, Luke's account of Paul's life lists 3 different imprisonments. He has the imprisonment in Philippi. He then, after he returns to Jerusalem at the end of his 3rd missionary journey, he ends up in imprisonment in Caesarea Maritime, and then Acts concludes with Paul under house arrest in Rome. However, when you look at Paul's own letters, where he gives himself information about his life, and especially when we look at 2 Corinthians, Paul makes mention of having been in prison on numerous occasions before he even gets to the end of his 3rd missionary journey. So maybe it's one of those imprisonments that he is enduring when he writes these prison epistles. There is also then the evidence from early church tradition that maintains that Paul was actually released at the end of that imprisonment at the end of Acts, that he then went on to Spain or in other places around the Mediterranean world, and that at a later date he was rearrested, and it was from that imprisonment, which may have been in Rome or may have been in some other place, it was at the end of that imprisonment that Paul was executed. Suffice to say, though, there is lots of debate then when it comes to each one of these letters as to which imprisonment we might be talking about when Paul refers to himself being in prison as he writes these letters. Let's kick off with Paul's letter to the Philippians. So there's a few things that we need to say by way of background to the letter to the Philippians in relation to Philippi itself as a city, and also Paul's history with the church. Philippi, as you probably know, is in Macedonia. It was a city that was founded by Philip of Macedon, after whom it's named, the father of Alexander the Great, and he settled it in 356 BCE. It then became a Roman colony and was resettled by Roman soldiers when the Roman Emperor Augustus gave the city to his veterans after his ultimate victory in a series of Roman civil wars that rocked the Roman Empire to its core in the 50 years or so leading up to the birth of Jesus. Consequently, Philippi is an overtly loyal city to Rome. Its citizens, as I said, are descendants of Roman veterans. They owe their citizenship to the emperor, and therefore they are very demonstrative in their loyalty to the emperor and consider themselves his clients, and that the emperor and his family are serving as their patrons. So they make a big deal about being loyal to the emperor. According to Acts, Paul planted the church in Philippi after, on his 2nd missionary journey, he wandered his way through Asia Minor, but then received a dream of a man in Macedonia saying, "Come over to here and help us." The church in Philippi is made up of predominantly Gentile believers. There not even being enough Jews to form a synagogue in Philippi, according to Acts. Unlike Paul's relationship with his churches in, say, Galatia or Corinth, Paul's relationship with the church in Philippi is very warm. In fact, they've had a long and close partnership over a period of years where the church in Philippi on numerous occasions has sent Paul financial and moral support as he goes about his apostolic mission. In fact, as a result of one of these gifts that the Philippians have sent to Paul in his imprisonment, that is one of the triggers for the letter to the Philippians. So let's read this section right near the end of the letter. Paul says, "I rejoice greatly in the Lord that at last you renewed your concern for me. Indeed, you were concerned, but you had no opportunity to show it. As you Philippians know, in the early days of your acquaintance with the gospel, when I set out from Macedonia, not one church shared with me in the matter of giving and receiving except you. For even when I was in Thessalonica, you sent me more than once when I was in need. I have received full payment and have more than enough. I am amply supplied now that I have received from Epaphroditus the gift that you sent." So why did Paul write the letter to the Philippians? Well, there's a few things that we can glean from the letter itself. Firstly, and from the passage that we just read, one of the reasons Paul is writing, because he wants to say thank you to the Philippians for the gift that they've sent him in prison. It is, however, a very curious thank you. If you read that passage again and at length, you'll discover that Paul never actually uses the phrase thank you. He doesn't express sort of gratitude for their gift. In fact, he almost seems to say the opposite. He seems to be at pains to say, look, you sent me this gift, I've received it, I'm amply supplied, but you know what? I've actually learned how to get along with very little. The point that he seems to be making is what Paul is more interested in is not so much himself receiving financial aid, but the Philippians coming under God's blessing for their generosity towards him. A second reason he writes the letter, and he says this early on in chapter 1, is that he wants to give them an update of how things are going for him in prison. Understandably, given the warm relationship between them, the Philippians would be concerned to know how are things going for Paul in prison. It says in Philippians chapter 1 verse 12, "Now I want you to know, brothers and sisters, that what has happened to me has actually served to advance the gospel." So even though he's in prison, he's sending them good news about how things are going with him. Thirdly, he's about to send Timothy to them, and so he wants to prepare them so that when Timothy arrives, they're not surprised or unduly concerned. In chapter 2, verse 19, he says, "I hope to send Timothy to you soon, that I may be cheered when I receive news about you." Fourthly, he's about to send Epaphroditus back to them. And this is an interesting scenario. Let's read a passage here first, and then we'll explain what's going on here. He says, "But I think it's necessary," in chapter 2:25, "to send back to you Epaphroditus, my brother, co-worker and fellow soldier, who is also your messenger, whom you sent to take care of my needs." He goes on to say that Epaphroditus fell sick, and he was concerned that the Philippians had heard that he was sick, and that they were worried, and he was worried that they were worried, which is really a rather odd set of circumstances. Perhaps what's really going on is that Epaphroditus was sent by the Philippians not just to bring Paul a gift, but to stay with Paul and to serve him during his imprisonment, to be a kind of an assistant. But Epaphroditus has fallen sick, and now Paul needs to send him back because he's more of a burden than an assistance. And so rather than Paul sending Epaphroditus back to Philippi in shame, he wants to prepare the way for his return and say, you need to honor men like Epaphroditus because he risked his life in order to bring your gift. Fifthly, Paul wants to prepare the Philippians for the arrival, or to be on their guard for some Judaizers. We've met them before in Galatians. He says in chapter 3 verse 2, "Watch out for those dogs, those evildoers, those mutilators of the flesh." This is very unkind language. There's lots of speculation about whom these people might be, and I think the best guess is that these are Jewish Christians who are traveling around Paul's churches and encouraging the Gentile believers that they need to become Jews and get circumcised in order to follow Christ. Similar to the people that we have encountered in the church in Galatia. What is also of interest is, have these people arrived in Philippi yet? Well, maybe not, because Paul says be on your guard. He doesn't seem to address them directly. But he is concerned that this church that is close to his heart might be destabilized by the arrival of these troublemakers. And lastly, and perhaps most significantly, the reason that Paul is writing to the Philippians is to address a case of disunity and discord that threatens to tear the Philippian church apart. Especially troublesome is the fact that this might happen whilst they're experiencing suffering and opposition at the hands of these loyal Roman citizens that make up the population of Philippi. Before we get into the letters themselves, I'd like to spend a few moments looking at an exegetical technique that we've been using already. We were using it back when we did Romans and Galatians, and certainly when we did the Corinthian correspondence. And we're also going to be employing it when we come to the prison epistles. And that exegetical technique is known as mirror reading. When we read one of the letters, what we've realised is that these occasional letters are deeply embedded in the context in which they were written and the context that they are written to. But in a sense, they're a bit like one side of a conversation. We've only got what Paul is saying to his audience. We don't have anything specifically from the audience back to Paul that allows us to sort of build both sides of this conversation. So what we need to do then, through a careful and close reading of the text, is see if we can reconstruct the other side of the conversation. The first thing we do when we try to do this is we look closely at the text and we look for clues that give us perhaps some indirect information about the context itself. Details possibly mentioned in passing that give us some clues about the setting, the people, the topics, the issues, what might be going on in the background. And sometimes there are those passing references there which we can help build or reconstruct the other side of the conversation. But secondly, and this is where mirror reading really comes into its own, is we'd look at what the author is saying, the ideas and the themes that they're presenting and the rhetorical devices that he's using to get his point across. And we work on the assumption that the author isn't just saying those things for no reason, but the things that the author is saying is specifically targeted to address the issues that are taking place in the life of the congregation. The clearest example we have of this, or the place where it is used probably to greatest effect, is in the letter to the Galatians. If you remember, we had a scenario there where Paul is writing to the Galatian church, and the Galatian church had been disturbed by these Jewish Christian false teachers who had been teaching a false gospel to the Galatians. The question we want to ask ourselves is, what actually was the content of that false gospel? The way that we go about it is by doing mirror reading. We read the things that Paul says in defense of himself and his gospel and the argument that he mounts to the Galatians to undermine their allegiance to this false gospel. And by using mirror reading and looking at and analysing the things that Paul says, enables us to try and reconstruct what was the false message that these false apostles were preaching that Paul is now specifically addressing. And that's the way that mirror reading works. And so when we come here firstly to Philippians, what we're going to do is look at the arguments that Paul is making, the things that he says, the themes that he addresses, and the way that he goes about addressing those issues. Because it's like he's talking into a mirror, and the things that he says are targeted to address the issues that are going on in the Philippian church and later on in the Colossian and the Ephesian churches. When we engage in mirror reading, though, we must be very careful because it's a difficult and complex business. And we're always really, at the end of the day, speculating about what might be going on the other side of the mirror, on the other side of the conversation. So typically what exegetes engage in is the forming of a hypothesis based on their mirror reading. And what they seek to do is come up with a scenario which best explains why it is that Paul is talking about the things that he's talking about. And the hypothesis that gets the most prominent or the greatest degree of consensus in the scholarly community is that hypothesis that seems to explain more of what Paul says in the most satisfying and comprehensive way. So you'll see mirror reading at work in the studies of all of the letters of the New Testament, trying to reconstruct with greater clarity and with greater depth what might be going on on the ground behind these occasional letters. So having said that, how does Paul go about dealing with the problem of disunity in the Philippian church? One of the things we're going to have a look at now is how he actually unpacks a rather long approach or a long strategy for dealing with the problem of disunity, and we can learn a lot from how Paul goes around about doing it. The first step that he takes is right at the very beginning in chapter 1. Paul's in prison in Rome. And what he refers to there is that there are two different groups there in Rome who respond to his imprisonment in different ways. There's one group who are loyal to Paul, who love that he's there, and they're inspired to preach Jesus more fervently because of Paul's example. There's another group of people who are envious of Paul and try to stir up trouble for Paul while he's there and preach Christ out of envy. So notice what Paul says in Philippians 1, verses 17 and 18. He says, "The former preach Christ out of selfish ambition, not sincerely, supposing that they can stir up trouble for me while I'm in chains. But what does it matter? The important thing is that in every way, whether from false motives or true, Christ is preached. And because of this, I rejoice." This is a remarkable thing for Paul to say, but it also lays a foundation for what he wants to go on and say, because he presents himself an example of someone who, by all rights, should be annoyed that people are treating him with such disdain. His own ambition, if he had some, would rise to the surface, and his own selfishness, if he had any, would fight back and resist and denounce these people who are stirring up trouble for him out of envy. Instead, what does he say? Or whether from false motives or true or pure ones, he rejoices that at least Christ is being preached. Whatever happens to him is inconsequential as far as Paul is concerned. Second step in his strategy is found in chapter 2, where Paul addresses the Philippian congregation as a whole and encourages them towards unity and humility and to combat selfish ambition. So in Philippians 2, verses 2 to 4, he says, "Make my joy complete by being like-minded, having the same love, being of one spirit and one mind. Do nothing out of selfish ambition or vain conceit. Rather, in humility, value others above yourselves, not looking out to your own interests, but each of you to the interests of others." So here he is setting up that underlying ethic that everyone in the congregation needs to be adopting to put aside selfish ambition and look out for each other. The third step is to then present Jesus as the ultimate example of how to go about living like this and for them to model themselves on Christ. This is the famous Christ hymn. In Philippians 2, verses 5 to 9, he says, "In your relationship with one another, have the same mindset as Christ Jesus, who being in the very nature God, did not consider equality with God something to be used to his own advantage. Rather, he made himself nothing by taking the very nature of a servant. Therefore, God exalted him to the highest place and gave him the name that's above every other name." The Philippians should follow Jesus as their example of humble service towards each other. And then finally, Paul hones in on the actual source of the disunity and disagreement. A fight, it would seem, between two prominent women, maybe wealthy patrons in the church. He says in Philippians 4, verses 2 and 3, "I plead with Euodia and I plead with Syntyche to be of the same mind in the Lord. Yes, and I ask you, my true companion, help these women, since they have contended at my side in the cause of the gospel, along with Clement and the rest of my co-workers whose names are in the book of life." But notice here how Paul addresses these two women. He doesn't criticize them. He doesn't have a go at them. Rather, he urges them to do the right thing, and at the same time he expresses value and honour towards them. He also appoints another leader to also come alongside them and help them be reunited. So notice how Paul has gone about dealing with this problem of disunity. He could have, right at the very beginning of the letter, addressed Euodia and Syntyche, and he could have confronted them in a harsh way and required them to sort out their differences. But instead, he unfurled a more sensitive strategy. He set himself up as an example of forsaking selfish ambition and focusing on the main thing, the preaching of the gospel. He then urged the congregation as a whole to put aside selfish ambition and humility to serve one another and to love one another and look out for each other's needs. He then presented Jesus as an example of setting aside selfish ambition and to humble himself and to serve others, and that is the route for God to exalt somebody. So that when he finally comes to address the source of the disunity, the congregation has already bought into this idea of putting aside selfish ambition and being humble and looking out for others, so that the women involved themselves have got nowhere left to turn. They have to say, okay, Paul, we'll do what you want us to do, because they can't say, no, we're not going to, because everything that Paul has set up till this point has been moving them progressively to the point where they can easily accept that they too need to set aside their own selfish ambition, which is the source of their disunity, and humility, love one another and serve one another. Why is Paul concerned about this disunity? Well, obviously, disunity is poor reflection upon the preaching of the gospel. But more so, Paul is concerned that as the Philippians are living in Philippi, where they are proclaiming that Jesus is Lord in the face of a society that is adamantly loyal to the emperor, they are experiencing opposition and persecution. If they can't be unified, if they start fracturing at their core, they're not going to stand. So Paul addresses their disunity in order to ensure that they're able to continue to remain a viable and vital and life-giving witness to Jesus in the middle of the Philippian city. So now we come to talking about Ephesians and Colossians. Before we dive into these two letters individually, there are a few introductory subtopics that we need to make some reference to. And these are to do with some things that you're going to find whenever you drop into the scholarly literature on Paul or these two letters. And this has to do with the question of authorship and the two letters' literary dependence upon each other. Firstly, when it comes to the topic of authorship, whenever you read any work on Pauline scholarship or on Ephesians and Colossians, you're going to find that Paul's letters are divided into two categories: the undisputed letters, for whom Paul's authorship is not questioned, and the disputed letters, for whom Paul's authorship is often questioned, in fact, sometimes seriously doubted. Let me give you a little bit of background to that so that you can orient yourself to that debate and not be put off when you first encounter that kind of discussion. We'll take a longer or a more detailed look at the kind of analysis that scholars engage in when they're evaluating authorship when we get to the when we get to the pastoral epistles. But for now, let me give you a little bit of an overview. In the early to mid-19th century, under the dominant influence of German biblical scholarship in general and the specific influence of Ferdinand Bauer and the Tübingen Schooler, the authorship of just about every book of the Bible was subjected to fairly intense critical scrutiny. This was motivated by an agenda to release academic biblical scholarship from the control of the church, so that the study of the Bible could be done on a foundation of scientific historical research rather than being constrained by the unscientific presuppositions of faith, dogma and superstition. Their approach was so dominant that it has basically set the agenda for biblical studies ever since. So that even if a scholar doesn't share the hypercritical agenda of that school, they're still going to have to deal with the agenda that this school has established as being the standard understanding of the territory. So when it comes to Ephesians and Colossians, we find that the the scholarship to do with the authorship of these books is questioned based on a comparison of these letters with Paul's other letters. And in particular, they compare the vocabulary, the style, and the theology of Ephesians and Colossians against Paul's other letters. The scholarly consensus when it comes to Colossians is evenly divided as to whether Paul was or wasn't the author of that particular letter. However, when we come to Ephesians, the scholarly consensus leans more towards Paul not being the author, and perhaps someone has written Ephesians under Paul's name, but at some point after Paul's death. Now, it'd be a mistake to think that the dividing line when it comes to authorship is neatly split between conservatives and liberals, because there are scholars of either persuasion in both camps. The conservative scholars, to be granted, are more inclined to try and seek a defence for Pauline authorship, but in any case, any scholar is going to have to go where the evidence leads them. This then leads us to the topic of literary dependence. Because when you compare Ephesians and Colossians with each other, we find remarkable similarities. And the ways that they are similar are ways that both of those letters are rather different from the rest of Paul's letters. This leads scholars to suggest that whoever wrote Colossians may have had Ephesians in his hand, or whoever wrote Ephesians may have had Colossians in his hands and then borrowed content from one of the other letters to make it look like it was written by Paul. However, it's a complex issue to get to the bottom of, and it's rather difficult to make firm conclusions. It's just as likely that Paul was the author of both letters, and the reason that they are different from the rest of his letters is because of issues that were specific to the church in Ephesus and Colossae. And also the reason that they are so similar is because they were written very close to each other, and therefore certain topics are fresh or uppermost in Paul's mind, hence making an appearance in both letters. So now let's look at Colossians. As you can see on the slide, Colossae is a city in the province of Asia Minor, just inland from Ephesus. What do we know, or what can we learn about the writing of Colossians and what might be going on in the background of the letter? Let me read a passage for you out of chapter 4. My fellow prisoner Aristarchus sends you his greetings, as does Mark, the cousin of Barnabas. Epaphras, who is one of you and a servant of Christ Jesus, sends greetings. He is always wrestling in prayer for you, that you may stand firm in all the will of God, mature and fully assured. I vouch for him that he is working hard for you and for those at Laodicea and Hierapolis. Give my greetings to the brothers and sisters at Laodicea and to Nympha and the church in her house. After this letter has been read out to you, see that it is also read out in the church of the Laodiceans, and that you in turn read the letter from Laodicea. So here's a range of things that we can learn from this passage and a few others in the letter. Firstly, the author, and we're going to go with Paul, is in prison with several others who are sending their greetings. One of the people with Paul is Epaphras. This is a key person in the life of the Colossian church. There's no reference in Acts or in any of Paul's other letters to him establishing a church in Colossae or even being there. So how is it that Paul is now writing a letter there? How did the church get started? Well, in Colossians 1 verse 7, we learn that the church was founded by Epaphras. He's a Colossian local, and perhaps the scenario behind its planting is that Epaphras came under Paul's influence through his preaching of the gospel when Paul was in Ephesus, as described in Acts 19. Then, perhaps inspired by his newfound faith in Christ, he returns to his hometown to preach the gospel and to establish a church there. The church, as we can tell, has close connections with churches in some nearby cities, the cities of Laodicea and Hierapolis. Possibly Epaphras planted those churches as well, or maybe some others who were part of Paul's larger apostolic team when he was located in Ephesus. But why is Paul writing to this church? In 2 Corinthians, Paul makes a big deal about not wanting to encroach on the territory of other people, but to focus on churches which are his own. So why would he be writing to a church that he didn't plant and to whom he has never been? Well, we'd learn from this letter that Epaphras has come to Paul in prison, and presumably he's brought a report to Paul about how things are going on the ground in Colossae. It may be the case that because Epaphras had come under Paul's leadership and then planted the church, that Paul has some standing as an apostle within the life of the church anyway. And so Epaphras invites Paul to write a letter to the church there to address some issues on the ground. What's also interesting is that at the same time that this letter is written to the church in Colossae, a letter is also written to the church in Laodicea. And Paul encourages both churches to swap their letters and read each other's letters. This is an interesting example of the way that Paul's letters came to be copied and circulated amongst Paul's churches as what ultimately leads to the formation of the New Testament canon. It may also be an example of an early circular letter. The rest of Paul's letters we understand to be occasional letters, letters that were written to a specific church to deal with a specific issue going on in the life of that congregation. A circular letter, by contrast, is one that is written to a range of churches to deal with an issue that may be of general applicability to them all, or just to say general things to exhort Christians in a range of places to continue to be faithful in their walk with Jesus. What is interesting, though, is this passage gives us some real insight into what's going on in the life of Paul's apostolic team and the way that Paul goes about communicating with his churches. So what is the main problem on the ground in Colossae? Well, there's one particular feature that stands out both in the letter and in the literature. It's what is known as the Colossian philosophy, or in other places, the Colossian heresy. Paul refers to it in Colossians 2 verse 8. He says, "See to it that no one takes you captive through hollow and deceptive philosophy, which depends on human tradition and the elemental spiritual forces of this world rather than on Christ." It doesn't drive the entire letter, but it does seem to shape to a considerable degree the content of what Paul goes on to talk about. It comes under specific criticism and critique in chapter 2, and is also likely to be behind Paul's discussion on the supremacy of Christ in chapter 1, and also as well to be behind the exhortations to Christian living and ethical transformation, and also his instruction to Christian households in chapters 3 and 4. So what can we tell about the tenets of this Colossian philosophy? It seems to be to focus on the restrictions to do with eating certain foods. We learn about that in chapter 2, verses 16 and 21. It also seems to involve keeping some form of religious or ritual calendar, particularly new moon celebrations and Sabbath days. That's in chapter 2, verse 16. It also involves self-abasement and the worship of angels in chapter 2, verse 18. It also forbids the touching and tasting and handling of certain things. It doesn't tell us what. It seems that these taboos and self-abasement can form a sort of asceticism, the harsh treatment of the body and the keeping of strict ritual practices for the purposes of spiritual enlightenment or empowerment, or for the putting of a constraint upon sinful passions. The philosophy also includes beliefs about what Paul calls the elemental spiritual forces of the cosmos, these principalities and powers, these that served as mediators or go-betweens, the divine and the human realms. And perhaps this ascetic ritual and treatment of the body served as a way to engage with these powers so that someone could gain access to the divine realm. Now, although we know these concrete details about the philosophy, we know very little else about it. For example, we don't know its origin. It seems to combine Jewish, pagan, and philosophical elements in a rather interesting combination. We don't know its worldview or its elaborate belief system. We don't know what particular benefits it presented or offered to its adherents or to the Colossian Christians. And we don't know specifically about how it put its beliefs into ritual practice. We also don't know the degree to which the Colossians were influenced by this philosophy, or whether they had incorporated in some kind of syncretistic fashion into their discipleship practices. Presumably, though, it presents enough of a danger to the Colossian Christians that Paul needs to address it in his letter. So how does he go about addressing it? Well, he says he's got a few ways of going about confronting it. Firstly, he describes the glory, the exaltation, and the supremacy of Christ, including his supremacy over these elemental spiritual forces. In fact, he says that Jesus has triumphed over these powers through his cross, and that they no longer need to be taken into account by Christian believers. He then goes on to say of this asceticism and that this philosophy has the appearance of wisdom, but lacks any value in restraining sensual indulgence. He says that in chapter 2, verse 23. Rather, he says that it's connection to Christ alone which provides the kind of nourishment and strengthening that Christians need. And he goes on to then describe the proper way that a Christian should orient themselves towards the divine. In chapters 3 and 4, he firstly says that we should set our heart and our eyes on Christ seated in heavenly places. Secondly, that we should put to death our old self and its way of life and its practices, and that we should put on the new self and its practices: compassion, humility, forgiveness, and love. Let's look at the letter to the Ephesians in the time that we've got remaining. As you can see on the map, Ephesus is the provincial capital of Asia Minor. It's on a major harbour and at the joining of major sea and land trade routes. We read about Paul's founding of the church in Ephesus on his second missionary journey in Acts 19. And the church that he founded there served as an apostolic base to reach out to the whole province. It's also a significant religious centre, and religion is woven into the fabric of Ephesian life. There are three major dimensions to this religious phenomena here. The first one is the massive temple to Artemis. That temple was so large it was listed as one of the wonders of the ancient world. Artemis, or Diana, was worshipped as the Eastern mother goddess. Statues of Artemis depict her with signs of the zodiac around her shoulders and rows of many breasts between her neck and her waist, representing her then as the god who sustains all of the other gods of the atmosphere. These statues also depict her with a skirt that has gargoyles of half-beast and half-human creatures, which represent her as also sustaining the gods of the underworld. Thus, what we see then is Artemis in Ephesus is the chief god, sustaining all of the other gods. Thus, when a riot breaks out in Acts 19, the crowd cries out, "Great is Artemis of the Ephesians." The worship of Artemis is obviously a big deal religiously, but it was also a significant economic powerhouse for Ephesus, as is suggested by the riot that is led by Alexander the silversmith in Acts 19. And what is clear from that account is that he and the silversmiths are concerned that their economic livelihood is being undermined by Paul's preaching of Christ. A second dimension of the religious life of Ephesus is the imperial cult. We'll learn about this a little bit more later on, but this is the cult that honours the Roman emperor as either a god incarnate or as a representative of the Roman gods. And so worship of the emperor is one of the ways that the Roman gods themselves are honoured and venerated. Ephesus had the status of the Neocorus, the temple warden of the imperial cult, a title that they wore with much civic pride. A third dimension of the religious life of Ephesus is magic. Magic was rife in Ephesus, and we read about this in Acts 19 when large numbers of Ephesians were converted they had a book burning where they brought all of their magic books out and burnt them in the public square. All of this is relevant for the young church in Ephesus because it would have found itself in direct conflict with these religious institutions and the religious, social and economic power they would have wielded over the Ephesian inhabitants. And this suggests a reason for some of the distinctive features we find of Paul's letter to the Ephesians. In particular, it is the letter in the New Testament which has possibly the highest number of references to power, spiritual power, the spiritual principalities and powers, the powers of Christ, the power of the Spirit that is available to believers, and in particular the long section about spiritual warfare in Ephesians chapter 6. So let's have a look at some of these passages and tease out what might be going on behind them. Firstly, let's have a look at Paul's prayer for the Ephesians as part of his very long introduction in chapter 1. Let me read it out for you. He says, he prays that they may know the incomparably great power for us who believe. That power is the same as the mighty strength he exerted when he raised Christ from the dead and seated him at his right hand in the heavenly realms, far above all rule and authority, power and dominion, and every name that is invoked, not only in the present age, but also in the one to come. And God placed all things under his feet, that's Jesus' feet, and appointed him to be head over everything for the church. In ancient religious practice, one of the ways that you would invoke the favor of the gods in your life is by learning their names and reciting their names. That would draw the gods' attention towards you. Unfortunately, there are lots of gods and therefore lots of names to learn. So, therefore, everyone is interested in a shortcut, and this is where Artemis comes in. Because in the Artemis temple, worshippers would be inducted to what was known as the Ephesian grammata, 4 words which encapsulated in Artemis all of the names of the other gods. And so when Paul refers here to Jesus being placed far above all rule and authority, power and dominion, those 4 words bear striking conceptual resemblance to the 4 words that make up the Ephesian grammata. So what Paul is suggesting here, that by giving your allegiance to Christ, who has got all authority and power and dominion and rule, his authority triumphs over anything that Artemis has to offer. In his prayer, though, Paul also referred to every name that is invoked. And this is clearly a reference to the names of the gods that a normal pagan worshipper would invoke, and says that Jesus is more powerful than all of the names of the gods that the Ephesians might be tempted to include in their spiritual life. They can forsake all of the other gods and give their exclusive allegiance to Jesus, both in this present age and also in the age to come. That is true triumph over the principalities and powers. But what is the evidence of Christ's power? Well, this brings in some of the other rather unique features of the Ephesian letter. Firstly, it's that his power is demonstrated through God's reconciliation of humanity to himself, a vertical reconciliation. But it was also demonstrated through his reconciliation of humanity to itself, a horizontal reconciliation. And by this we mean the tearing down of the dividing wall between Jew and Gentile. As it says in Ephesians 2 verses 15, as his purpose here is to create in himself one new humanity out of 2. And this tearing down of this dividing wall and this forming of a new humanity points towards God's ultimate purpose, the ultimate goal being the summing up of all things and the reuniting of all things together in Christ. As it says in chapter 3, verses 10 and 11, his intent was that now through the church, the manifold wisdom of God should be made known to the rulers and authorities in the heavenly realms. according to his eternal purposes that he accomplished in Christ Jesus our Lord. As another example, let's race ahead to the end of the book and come to that famous passage to do with spiritual warfare. As I've already mentioned, the longest passage to do with spiritual warfare in the New Testament. It says, "Finally, be strong in the Lord and in his mighty power. Put on the full armour of God so that you can take your stand against the devil's schemes. For our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the powers of this dark world, and against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly realms." You can hear Paul here making reference to the spiritual environment in Ephesus with all of its different religious dimensions. He goes on to say, "Therefore put on the full armour of God so that when the day of evil comes, you may be able to stand your ground. And after you've done everything to stand, stand firm then with," and he lists them, "the belt of truth, the breastplate of righteousness, feet fitted with the gospel of peace, the shield of faith, the helmet of salvation, and the sword of the Spirit." This passage on spiritual warfare doesn't stand as a standalone segment, but rather is integrated into the message of the entire letter. And it serves as a compelling and memorable summing up, if you will, of everything that has gone before. So let's rehearse then the sort of things that Paul has been saying that equips the church to stand firm in this rather hostile environment in Ephesus. Firstly, you remember he said to them that they find themselves in a spiritual conflict, a conflict that Christ has already overcome in. Secondly, he says that their enemies will be overcome by, and here he uses a fairly standard Roman way of thinking where they said that Rome would overcome its enemies through strong families that then together formed a strong state, and then they would defeat their enemies. Paul sort of rehabilitates that idea and promotes the notion that as the church forms together strong families that then combine to form a strong church, when they live like that, they will then be able to defeat their spiritual enemies. So then that accounts for the things that Paul says in chapters 3 and 4. For example, the instructions to Christian households to form strong families is an essential ingredient in the strategy to defeat the enemy. Similarly, his encouragements to release gifted leadership to function in their roles in church life, and for each individual member to bring their unique gifting to nurture and to build up the body of Christ, is the way that strong families will then combine together to form a strong church. And further to that, Paul's encouragements to unity and to transformed life, where they'll put off sin and that old way of life corrupted by evil desires and put on the new life, which is being renewed in its attitude and renewed to look like Christ in love and humility and peace. As the believers do that, they unify themselves, they form a strong church that at its heart has got strong families, and this is actually the way to go about spiritual warfare. And this is the way that a strong church is going to be united with all of the armour of God working together in their community together, which will enable them to stand strongly against the schemes and onslaughts of the enemy. Clearly, this is tremendous advice from Paul, tremendous instruction, because Ephesus probably formed a very hostile environment to the church there, both religiously and spiritually, as well as socially and economically. So his letter to the Ephesians then is one long encouragement and instruction on how they can do all of these things together as a form of spiritual warfare to stand strong against these spiritual forces of wickedness.